Okay, moving on to what is perhaps Kierkegaard's most well-known work, most famous work, Fear and Trembling. And again, in this work, he actually says in a journal that for the first time, or out of all the writings I've done, I really feel like Fear and Trembling is my best. I finally got it all out there, what I'm trying to get at. And once again, he's thinking the element of faith or truth as subjectivity, or the absurd. He's a thinker of the absurd. He's thinking the absurdity of faith, this time under the pseudonym of Johannes di Silencio, John of Silence, or John the Silent, who doesn't have faith. He admits he doesn't have faith. He's looking at it from the outside in, and it looks nuts to him. It looks absurd, right? And you want to keep with when you think about the way Kierkegaard's thinking about faith as an absurdity, as an offense, as a kind of lunacy, keep to the analogy of being in love. When someone's in love, they act and do very strange things from the outside looking in. It's perfectly reasonable to the person in love, but from the outside looking in, people look nuts. They look manic. And that's exactly how Abraham looks to all of us who don't have faith, right? And he's thinking of Abraham and the famous story in Genesis, the binding of Isaac, where God says to Abraham, sacrifice your son, your only son, or the son of the promise, rather, as an act of faith. And of course, God stops Abraham in the end. But nevertheless, my phone's ringing here. That's what he's thinking, and he's looking at Abraham, and he's analyzing Abraham as under the guise or under the category of what he calls the knight of faith. Okay, and you want to keep thinking about everything we've been talking about so far. Kierkegaard's critique of reason, in particular Hegel, right? One thing I haven't mentioned before is Hegel has a very famous saying that the rational is the real, and the real is the rational. The rational is the real, and the real is the rational. For Kierkegaard, that's nuts, right? Existence or the real cannot be thought. Hegel thought there was a one-to-one correspondence between existence and rationality, and Kierkegaard is saying, no, faith is the one thing that escapes that. You cannot go beyond faith. He's got a great line in the text about faith will turn water into wine, but then when you go beyond faith, when you try to make it intelligible and reason about it, you turn wine back into water. And Hegel thought you can actually go beyond faith. What did he mean by that? Well, Hegel says very famously, well, I'm not going to quote him, so it's not very famously. This is a famous idea, I'm paraphrasing, I guess, that philosophy and theology have the same content, or namely God, but philosophy is higher because it thinks God not under myth and pictures and symbols, but it thinks God in terms of rational categories, and that's going beyond faith. That's precisely what Kierkegaard is disagreeing with in this text, in his analysis of Abraham. Under the pseudonym Johannes di Silencio, from the outside looking in, Abraham looks like a lunatic, like a maniac, right? Like a homicidal lunatic even. Okay? Here he's thinking about faith as a leap, okay? What else? Let me, just as far as an introduction. The title, Fear and Trembling, comes from a famous passage in Philippians 2, after the what's called the kinetic passage, where Jesus empties himself. Right after that, Paul says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Okay, there's a paradox there, right? Work out your own salvation, but it's God working it out. So I think he's playing on that paradox. And then the element of faith that is this tension. And this is what he's trying to highlight here. When God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham doesn't just go, okay. He thinks that real faith involves a tension between what he calls, we're going to see, resignation and then wanting to get something back. And you want to hear in the background here the autobiographical element to Kierkegaard. Nietzsche says very famously, as you remember, I hope, all philosophy is autobiographical. Remember, Kierkegaard let Regina Olsen go, and he was hoping, believing that he would get her back, okay? And there's a very key passage that no one, I usually don't hear people talk about this when they're talking about fear and trembling, but it's from Hebrews 11, and I think it starts with verse 17. And listen to this, and this will give you a sense of what Kierkegaard is talking about. I think it summarizes the whole book in a certain sense. Hebrews 11, we don't know who wrote it. It's in the New Testament. But he's talking about Abraham as the father of faith. Abraham, throughout the New Testament, is referred to over and over again as the father of faith, in a very famous passage from Genesis 15:5, where it said, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him, or counted to him as righteousness. And this is a very important passage for St. Paul and for Martin Luther, insofar as your faith justifies you, or you're credited by your faith with justification before God, or righteousness before God. But I'll read it very quickly. Hebrews 11, and this is again the summary of fear and trembling as with regard to Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God, and this is the key line, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Figuratively speaking, he received him back. So in other words, Kierkegaard this is the summary of the whole book. He wants you to understand faith as not a blind trust, and not some kind of resignation where you give up, like a stoic resignation where you go, whatever, be it done unto me, whatever, I don't care what happens, I let it up to God. No. He wants you to want what you want, right? He wants Abraham to love his son so much that he can't do it. And he wants Abraham to love God so much that they're in conflict, and that's faith, okay? So how does that work? Well, faith in summary is Abraham wanting Isaac so bad and having to kill him because God says it, right? And when they meet, Abraham says, you know what? I'll do this, but I want Isaac back. I'm going to get Isaac back. And that's the key thing, of getting back, receiving back, okay? Think of Regina Olsen. Kierkegaard thought she was coming back, right? So it's a kind of absurd hope that the person of faith has, but it's not a naive hope either, okay? And we'll talk about this as we go along. Now, this is the key idea here, that when Abraham offered Isaac, Kierkegaard thinks, you get an insight into the absurdity of faith because Abraham did it knowing God was going to give him back, even if he killed him. That's the crazy thing, okay?